All right, welcome to Chapter 15 review. This is your last chapter for Anatomy and Physiology 1, and welcome to your hard work. Okay, so Chapter 15 review, the chapter's not that big, so I'm going to try to, and so the review's not that big, but I'm going to try to be as specific as I possibly can as we make our way through the material. Again, this is areas to focus on, is not a comprehensive review, so you're still responsible for all the readings when it comes to the chapter material. So let's start off real quick here. Dual control of the autonomic nervous system. So what I'm trying for you to understand is that the autonomic nervous system has both excitatory and inhibitory processes. And what are they? Obviously, sympathetic versus parasympathetics, which we'll get into in a little bit. So be familiar with dual concepts. So for example, those that are under dual control of the ANS would be like the iris, right? Dilation versus constriction of the pupil. Heart, salivary glands, digestive system. So if you think about the processes of the body and how we have to either excite them or inhibit them, then we're going to have changes that are going to be opposite of each other as we have this dual control of the autonomic nervous system. So be familiar with the dual control, some ideas and physiological changes that are out there that the textbook discusses when it comes to dual control of the ANS. Different receptors and their function. Well, alpha receptors versus beta receptors. As you go through the readings, think about a beta receptor and an alpha receptor. If we talk about medications that control heart rate, such as beta blockers or alpha blockers, then we could play on the idea of receptors of the heart or the cardiovascular system, where we can give medication to help slow down the heart rate by inactivating beta blockers or beta receptors using a beta blocker, or an alpha receptor using alpha medication to help decrease the effects of the alpha receptor. So understand these different alpha and beta receptors as discussed in the chapters and what their functions are. You know, there's beta 1, beta 2, alpha 1, alpha 2, and just be familiar with those type of structures. The great old fight or flight reactions, you know, what are they? Oh, not fight or fight. Say it's flight or fight reaction. I apologize for that typo, if you would. But we know there's a flight and fight reaction, right? We have sympathetic reactions. What are they? What may not happen, right? The last thing you want to do when you have to run away from a tiger is urinate, maybe, right? Think about that for instance, right? So make sure you understand those concepts of a fight or flight reaction. Again, it's not a fight or fight. It's a typo. I apologize. It's flight or fight. MAOs, right? Make sure you know what that means. What does that acronym mean? Or it's not even an acronym. What does that abbreviation mean? And what's its function? Where would you find that in the nervous system? Does it break down a neurotransmitter? Perhaps. There are some specific nerves you should be familiar with and where to locate. You're going to have some repeat of the cranial nerves. So we have the vagus nerve this chapter, the facial nerve, you have the splenic nerve, you have these enteric nerves, you have spinal nerves. Be familiar with them and their functions, where they're located. Right? For example, the facial nerve, which is right there on the screen, it rises from the pons. And its location of where it rises from is a parasympathetic nerve. The vagus nerve is parasympathetic as well, right? Controls swallowing. So be familiar with those type of ideas for each of these different nerves. Paravertebral and collateral ganglia. So if I have a paravertebral ganglion, you know, obviously you should know where is a paravertebral ganglion located. What's its function? Okay, we have ciliary ganglion. What's its function? Why is it located there? Specifically, when it comes to parasympathetics, back that up. Specifically when it comes to preganglionic and postganglionic fibers, which we'll get to in a second. So again, paravertebral ganglion and collateral ganglion. What are they? Where are they? What's their function? Sorry for the screen being cut off, but sympathetic versus parasympathetic effects. Very simple, right? Fight or flight or rest and relaxation. They're opposites, right? Make sure you know what they are, what they do. Some are excitatory, some are inhibitory. So forth and so on. When it comes to paravertebral ganglia, you should know that they are not parasympathetic. There's a hint for you. Okay, not parasympathetic. The ANS, autonomic nervous system, like we said back before, is dual control. So it has both excitatory and inhibitory processes. Sorry about the cutoff, but norepinephrine, serotonin, adenosine, and the other word there is nitric oxide. And nitric oxide is a neurotransmitter. Matter of fact, all of those up on the screen there, again, I apologize, norepinephrine, serotonin, adenosine, nitric oxide are all good old-fashioned neurotransmitters. Nicotinic receptors and acetylcholine. So what I want you to know here, this is an example. Nicotinic receptors and acetylcholine go together. Be able to match different receptors and their neurotransmitter. Okay, different receptors and their neurotransmitters. Be able to put those together. Different plexuses, if I even spelled that right, plexuses, right? Like a hypogastric plexus. We have, that's just an example of one. I'll give you some more as we go through the review. Pre and post ganglionic fibers, right? Some are long, some are short, some are directly at the target organ. Well, who is that? Who's at the direct target organ? Who's a distance away? So when it comes to pre and post ganglionic fibers, kind of relate that to your sympathetic and parasympathetic systems and be able to go ahead and put those together. Different nerves and their functions, again, with the pelvic, pudendal, and femoral. Know those. Be familiar with the cooperative effect. Right, we have a sympathetic effect, a dual effect, maybe a sympathetic effect, but there's also something called a cooperative effect. And what is a cooperative effect? Did I mention the hypogastric plexus? I think I did. Be familiar with the craniosacral system. You'll figure it out. You know what that is. When it comes to pre and post ganglionic fibers, there's a craniosacral system. Be familiar with that and the relationship between the craniosacral system and the pre and post ganglionic fibers. I said serotonin, I said MAO, adenosine, nitric oxide. Okay. Raynaud's disease. Be familiar with Raynaud's disease. And there's other diseases that are talked about in the chapter as well. So be familiar with an overview of those diseases. And Raynaud's is on the screen there. Baroreceptors, proprioceptors, chemoreceptors. Be familiar with those. The relationship between sympathetic, parasympathetic, somatic motor, and visceral motor. They kind of go together as well, but be familiar with those that are somatic motor. What does a somatic motor nerve do? What's a visceral motor nerve do? Obviously, it's input into an organ or a target system, right? Because it's leaving the spine, because it's motor, it's not efferent coming in. When it comes to preganglionic and postganglionic fibers, you should know what I said earlier, but also, if I'm a preganglionic fiber, I'm going to release acetylcholine. However, if I'm a postganglionic fiber, I can release acetylcholine or norepinephrine, depending upon where I'm located, what my function is. If you think about acetylcholine and norepinephrine, one could be inhibitory, one could be excitatory. So this is that dual innervation of the ANS. Lateral horns, ventral horns, dorsal horns. When you cut the spinal cord horizontally, right, you have a nice little butterfly. You have your gray matter versus white matter, your tracks that we went over a couple of chapters ago. Be familiar with them again. When it comes to ventral horn and lateral horns, sympathetic divisions versus parasympathetic divisions, preganglionic versus postganglionic. Okay, see the relationship there as well. Myelinated versus unmyelinated, preganglionic and postganglionic fibers. Right, so if we look at white rami, okay, white rami, since they're white, then you know they carry myelinated preganglionic fibers, while gray rami may carry unmyelinated postganglionic fibers, right? So if it's white, it's myelinated. If it's gray, there's no myelin. That's the difference when you cut the brain open, like chapter 14. You have white matter and you have gray matter. All the white matter is carrying information to and from the gray matter. Most of the time, the gray matter of the cortex of the brain is your multipolar neurons with all those thousands of dendrites doing all the processing and then sending information to and from other parts of the brain via the white matter. Okay, so be familiar with, again, unmyelinated preganglionic and unmyelinated postganglionic, or myelinated or not, white versus gray. Preganglionic, I said that already, and acetylcholine go together sometimes. Hint, hint. Know, you're going to have to know, again, your cranial nerves and your numbers as well for this chapter. Parasympathetic fibers, make sure you know where they come out of. Okay, where they come from. Where do they leave the spine? Versus your sympathetics, where do they leave the spine? Okay, so make sure you know those. And, okay. Understand ephedrine and neuroephedrine. I think there was a couple of cases ago back in the news where people died from ephedrine overdose, or just died from taking ephedrine from working out. Understand what ephedrine is and what's pseudoephedrine, right? And make sure you know what does it mimic, and what's its purpose. We had nicotinic receptors, and then we also, which I didn't bring up, we have nicotinic receptors up there in acetylcholine, but we also should be familiar with muscarinic receptors. What neurotransmitter works on a muscarinic receptor? Right, so be familiar with that muscarinic receptor. It kind of relates to inhibitory and stimulatory concepts, preganglionic and postganglionic. You can see it all kind of goes together. Alpha versus beta receptors, I said that when we first started, and that should pretty much wrap it up. So it's pretty quick. However, a lot of the material intertwines, all right, or is convoluted amongst itself, which means that they all relate together. So make sure you kind of have a good picture of how this chapter fits together, because there's multiple parts in this chapter 15, but they all relate to each other and they also function upon each other. So you should have no problem with that. Propranolol, right? Any medication that ends with an OL, that's the generic name, that is a beta blocker. And I kind of mentioned this back in the earlier of the review. Basically, what I'm asking you to put together is, if I have medication that needs to slow down the heart and it's a beta blocker, well, what's it doing? Is it blocking the alpha receptors? Probably not. Probably beta 1 or beta 2 receptors. But there's also medication that's an alpha receptor blocker or an alpha blocker. So be familiar with the concept. Really bring it to a real world relationship, and how this all functions, how we can play on the physiology of our heart or cardiovascular system by taking medication, right? So we have ACE inhibitors, that's a whole different ball game, but the concept's the same. Right? We alter physiology. So any questions, concerns, or comments, please feel free to email me. This is your last chapter. I wish you the best of luck on the last exam. I'm here to help, so feel free to reach out, and I will see you in class.